This is a man's world. This is a man's world. But it wouldn't be nothing, nothing without a woman or a girl.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a Man's World, the Genesis 3:16 Effect. I am your host, Haley Rose, curriculum developer at the Anastasis Center for Christian Education and Ministry, where our mission is to proclaim the restorative justice of God and the healing atonement of Jesus. Once again, if you're enjoying our content, please remember to like and subscribe and follow the link in our description to check out our website. I am joined once again by Rachel Darnall, our expert on the intersection of women's issues and Christian theology. And later, we'll be joined by a special guest, so stay tuned for that. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Haley. Good to be back.
So today we're talking about women in rule, and we're talking about how Christian patriarchy doesn't want women to rule, and we're exploring why. And some of that reason is because of their maternal role. Women are apparently too emotional and too empathetic to be objective. Rachel, take it away.
So today we're going to need to take a crash course on womanhood and rule and empathy and how these three concepts have interacted with each other since about the end of the 1700s. So going back even further than that, if we go back to the Garden of Eden and look at where human rule first began, we can see that God never intended rule to be a one-man job. He gave dominion of the world to Adam and Eve and their children. Altogether, dominion was supposed to be shared between all the members of the human race, beginning with male and female together. But we know from episode 1 that the man of dust, after the fall, he becomes very possessive of dominion. He rebels against God's agenda of co-dominion. And instead of sharing power, he wants to play the game King of the Hill. Now, if you have never played King of the Hill, here's how it goes. You find a hill and you try to get to the top of it, and you try to push other people down so that you can stay on top. So you win the game by pushing other people down so that you can stay on top. And that is pretty much how patriarchy works. But people do not like to admit, whether it's patriarchy or any other kind of power grab, they don't like to admit that the game that they're playing is King of the Hill. They would rather legitimize the rule as something higher than just might makes right.
I didn't actually know King of the Hill was a game until you said that. I thought it was just a phrase that people said, and I didn't really know what it meant.
Game.
That's terrible. I have never heard of or seen anybody do that. Whoa. But it makes sense, like, why you'd be like, well, I'm allowed to push you down. So on a societal level, how do they actually try and legitimize that?
So if we're talking about Western history, for a lot of Western history, they have used this concept called the divine right of kings. Now, the divine right of kings is basically the idea that this person is in power because God has appointed them to this position of power. And that means that they are kind of God's agent on earth. They can't be questioned. They certainly can't be fired. So the power is very unlimited. This also connects with the idea of primogeniture. And primogeniture just means firstborn. It refers to the right of the firstborn to inherit property or power. So in a monarchy, you have a dynasty where the first male child inherits power. And so obviously, second and third born sons are not going to inherit power. Daughters are just simply out of the running altogether. So primogeniture and patriarchy are very, very connected with the divine right of kings. In 1680, we actually have a treatise written by a guy named Robert Filmer. It was called Patriarcha, or the Natural Power of Kings. And his argument for the divine right of kings was that kings, in some convoluted way, were inheriting the fatherly authority of Adam. So the divine right of kings started to sort of fall out of favor with the Enlightenment.
I know a lot of things, but I'm ashamed to admit that I have to Google now what the Enlightenment is. Ugh, I can't know it all. What is the Enlightenment?
It's
Tell us.
okay. I'll save you a Google search.
Great.
So the Enlightenment, like a long story short, it's a roughly 100-year period leading up to major political revolutions, including the American Revolution and the French revolutions. I say revolutions because there were several. So it's this period that's laying the groundwork for things like equal human rights and self-government. Historian Robert Ritchie explains that the Enlightenment was really about the pursuit of happiness, if you want to put it all in a nutshell. He says, the Enlightenment declared the conviction that the goal of life was happiness, and that if this goal could be attained at all, it was to be found in the here and now, despite the manifold imperfections of earthly life.
It sounded like we needed a whole entire enlightenment, capital E, to figure that out.
Yeah, you would think, like, coming from our modern perspective, it's kind of assumed that we're all trying to be happy. We're trying to increase our own happiness and other people's. But there was an attitude prior to this of resignation. The attitude was that life is full of suffering. You really can't avoid it. So rather than trying to change the way things are, you should just accept it, and you should work towards having a better afterlife. So, happiness was something that was not accessible in this life. This especially applied if you were lower on the social hierarchy. So there was this idea, social mobility was a no-no. If you're a peasant, just be happy with being a peasant. That's where God put you. Don't try to move up in the world. So the Enlightenment pushes back against that, and they say, no, if our social systems are not creating the conditions for human happiness, then we can and we should change them. And one of the things that they wanted to change was the system of government. They argued that monarchs did not have unconditional authority, and that they did not derive their power from God, but from the consent of the governed. So the consent of the people could be either a tacit consent, so they're not really saying out loud that they consent, but they're not objecting to the rule either, or it could be expressed formally by voting. But the important thing is that this consent of the governed could be withdrawn if the king was not ruling in the people's interest anymore. So, in other words, the idea of the consent of the governed provided a moral framework for revolt.
Well, we know how that went. America declared independence from Great Britain. France, they got rid of their aristocracy. And then everybody got liberty, equality, democracy. We all live happily ever after, and everything's perfect, right?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, that would be nice. These were all great ideas, like liberty, democracy, equality. These are great ideas. But it turns out that it is really hard for people to actually give up that system, give up the game of playing King of the Hill. So they had this problem where they were arguing for equality, but there were people they did not really want to be included in that equality. So one of the first things that the Enlightenment did with their newfound rights was to make sure that their so-called inferiors would not get them too. And how did they do that? Well, they did that through the magic of science. So Lynn Hunt writes in Inventing Human Rights, A History, arguments for the rights of man had relied on the assumption of the sameness of human nature across cultures and classes. After the French Revolution, it became increasingly difficult to simply reassert differences on the basis of tradition, custom, or history. Differences had to have a more solid foundation if men were to maintain their superiority to women, whites to blacks, or Christians to Jews. As a consequence, the 19th century witnessed an explosion of biological explanations of difference.
Oh, yeah, we talked about that. Episode 4, we talked about eugenics. You know, U as in good and genics as in genes, good birth. And we talked about, and we've talked about this before at the Anastasis Center, there are scientific justifications for imperialism. That's just like whole groups of people playing King of the Hill. Slavery, I'm better than you, so I deserve to have you serve me. Racial genocide, we're all better than you, so we're allowed to kill all of you. This is using science as an explanation for why I'm allowed to hurt people is not new.
No, it's not. And it's very ironic that that really was brought in by this Enlightenment revolutionary period. It became the new divine right of kings. It replaced the divine right of kings concept.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the case of women, this took the form of what was called separate spheres ideology. And separate spheres ideology was kind of brought into vogue by a Genevan philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau wanted to have a republic. He wanted to have democracy. He wanted all men to participate in government. But he taught that public life and private life were these two separate spheres. Men were supposed to be managing the affairs of public life, so politics, leading intellectual movements, any kind of public role should be held by a man. And women's biological role and allegedly limited intellectual capacity naturally confined her to the private sphere of the home and the family. So women's contribution to Rousseau's ideal republic would just be to have a lot of children and raise them to be good citizens. So Rousseau claimed that women were going to be happy with this because they were not the same as men. They didn't have the same nature as men, and they were naturally submissive. So they wouldn't even really like or enjoy exercising personal freedom or political rights. And even at the time, you would think everybody would just accept this because, it's back then. But even at the time, there were people who recognized that all of this scientific posturing about gender difference. Yes. Every time I use
Scientific.
just hear the air quotes.
Yeah.
But they recognized that this was about protecting male power. So there was a politician named Nicolas de Condorcet. And in the wake of the French Revolution, he wrote this about women's exclusion from equal rights. A vain search was made for reasons to justify it by the differences in their physical organization, by the differences that people wished to find in the force of their intellect, in their moral sensibility. This inequality had no other origin than the abuse of strength, and it was in vain that people have tried since then to excuse it by means of plausible fallacies.
Ooh, plausible fallacies. Fallacies, but plausible. Oh, it's still going on today. There's all these like super big brain guys playing King of the Hill.
Yeah, you've talked about the games people play. And they're playing a different game. They're not playing the game of science. They're playing the game of, I have a certain position in society, I'm going to keep it, and I'm going to formulate my science in order to be able to do that.
Right.
So how does this all interact with empathy? When it comes to empathy, which was not actually a word yet at this point, they would have used the word sympathy in the same way that we use empathy. So a very interesting shift happens between the 1700s and the 1800s. And this shift was very much connected with the resistance to the inclusion of women in the equal rights that men were beginning to get. So initially, the Enlightenment was, on the whole, very pro-empathy, and empathy was seen as the basis for the idea of human equality and human rights. So, for instance, one of the things that laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment was the invention of the novel. There had been fictional writings, for hundreds of years before this, but the novel was a literary form that really brought you close to the character and let you into what they were thinking and feeling. And it let you empathize with people of different social classes, and that was very important. And women protagonists actually dominated novels. So some of the most popular ones during the 1700s were Pamela and Clarissa. Those were both by Samuel Richardson. Julie was by Rousseau. And those are all stories about women who are very vulnerable, especially sexually vulnerable, because the sexual vulnerability of poor and working class women just made them ideal protagonists for this kind of story, where you really wanted the audience to feel along with these people's emotions. So the ability to enter into the feelings of other people in this way was seen by some Enlightenment thinkers as actually being the basis for morality. For example, David Hume said that sympathy, i.e. empathy, is, quote, the chief source of moral distinctions. But in the 1800s, empathy was increasingly being seen as the domain of women. Separate spheres ideology was still very much in play, but it was changing, and the public sphere was now seen as including business as well as politics. As we have already seen in episode 3, according to Adam Smith and other economic theorists of the time, the economy ran on self-interest. If men were going to do well in this competitive world of commerce and making money, they had to operate by a different set of rules. So they needed to be free from pesky ideals like love your neighbor as yourself. And that meant that those things which society acknowledged were still necessary and important needed to be shifted over to the private sphere. So things like religion, emotion, love, charity, sympathy began to be seen as part of the private sphere. And it began to be seen as women's work. And as empathy began to be associated with women, as so often happens, it began to be looked down upon. It was no longer seen as the basis of morality, but as an impediment to objectivity. So, for example, we had in 1851, the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote a terrible essay called On Women. And he writes this: "It is because women's reasoning powers are weaker that they show more sympathy for the unfortunate than men, and consequently take a kindlier interest in them. On the other hand, women are inferior to men in matters of justice, honesty, and conscientiousness." And as far as Schopenhauer's morality, I want to point out that in the same essay, he approves of polygamy because he says that it makes women too uppity. Monogamy makes women uppity because they're like, now I have control of one man. So these are the kind of moral conclusions that his like sterile objectivity is leading him to. FYI.
You see, man made the car.
Joining us for this part of the discussion is Judge Tim Fall. Tim serves as a judge for the Superior Court of Yolo County, California. He's been a judge since 1995 with 3 decades of judicial experience. Welcome, Tim. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
One of the bios that I use a lot is that I tell people that I changed my major 3 times. I went to 4 different colleges, and I took 6 years to get a bachelor's degree in a subject I've never been called upon to use professionally. Beyond that, I ended up going to law school. I ended up becoming an attorney, practiced law for about 7.5 years, and then I became a judge at what even in California is a very young age, 35. And so I've been doing this for a while, and 30 years has gone by, still doing it. I I am married. We've been married for 37 years, and that'll be coming up on September of this year. We'll hit 37, 38 now. And then a couple of grown children, and we've got grandchildren. I've been an elder in my church. I've been a worship leader. I have preached on occasion and just filled the pulpit here and there, not anything regular, just once in a while got asked. And I also do a lot of teaching in judicial education. There's a lot of continuing ed for judges. We do many, many hours every year, every judge. And my teaching is principally in the area of judicial ethics.
So I think that's important to mention. Tim has told us, and he's telling us now, that he has to stay politically neutral. Nothing that we are discussing in this segment should be interpreted as an endorsement or a criticism of any politician or any political party.
I want representative government all the way down to the family. And I also want babies not murdered.
Yeah.
I don't want drag queen story hour. I don't want rainbow jihad. And none of that could happen if women couldn't vote. The way that you get licentiousness is you say that these wicked people who want to ruin the country, chop up babies in the womb, and have sodomy, that these people are oppressed. They're really well-meaning deep down, but they're misunderstood, they're having a hard time, and people are being mean to them. Men don't buy that narrative. Women do. Because women were built by God. This doesn't mean women are stupid. It's not a knock on women. They're not supposed to be good at that. Women were built by God to nurture, right? So when the 2-year-old falls and has a boo-boo and runs and says, "Mom, I hurt," that she pulls him in. She embraces him. She loves him and kisses him. Women were built to nurture. But criminals don't need nurturing, they need hanging. That's what men do well. Ketanji, Brown Jackson, light on pedophiles. Light on pedophiles. Because she'll look at a guy like that in her court and say, man, if only he had a good mom.
He must have had it hard.
He must have had it hard.
Yeah.
And men look at a guy like that and say, all right, it's either going to be a firing range or a gallows. Can we do it now? The sooner the better.
Nothing clears the mind like a noose.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's get into that clip that we just played. That was Joel Webbon, and he has been explaining why his version of a Christian nation, women would not vote and they would not hold public office. What do we think about that? Tim, what do you think about that?
I listen to people say things like that, and I think there is a person who has never spent any time in a courtroom and has absolutely no idea how the court system works. They also have spent no time in a courtroom with a woman sitting on the bench. I have had the great privilege of working with a number of women as my colleagues here in my own courthouse, and also working with women on judicial committees on the statewide level, putting on programs, conferences, working on policy committees. I've been doing a lot of this over the past 3 decades. I've been on committees with men and women who have been other judges from other parts of the state. And they're really smart, capable people. And he made his point. And I'm not saying women are dumb. Yeah, but you are saying they're incapable of certain things. That's completely not true. I see women and men carrying out the judicial function all the time. And our present Chief Justice of California and our immediate past Chief Justice, both women, both highly capable judges who have decades of experience before they became the Chief Justice of the state. Anyone who knows anything about courts and judging, if you compare their work with all of the men who came before them, people would say, yes, they are capable people who hold this office, the highest in the judiciary in California, and they well deserve to be carrying out that function. They're doing a better job than I would have done.
Mhm.
Tim, you and I were talking about the example of Deborah in the Bible, and we have this clear example in the Old Testament of a woman performing the role of judge and doing it very well. There's nothing negative said about her performance as a judge. And I find it really ironic that he says that because women are maternal, they're unable to carry out that judicial role. Deborah actually calls herself a mother of Israel. And that could be taken as she's just talking about, I am a mother who is Israelite, or it could be talking about her seeing her judicial role in terms of she is mothering the nation. So there is absolutely no biblical warrant for this idea that being maternal is going to prevent you from being a good judge.
Yeah, there's nothing in the Bible. They can never actually point to a verse that says women are incapable of exercising this type of judgment because they are women. There's just nothing biblical that goes with that. And Deborah is the one person who bears the title judge in the book of Judges who has not even a hint of criticism leveled at her.
Mm.
Gideon, he's criticized. It's like, yeah, what, you need another piece of proof, Gideon, here, okay. And the Israelites do criticize him, thinking he's setting himself up as high and mighty. You get to Samson, sure, he's the judge, but did you ever see him actually exercise judgment? Not at all. You have Deborah, not even a hint of it. And of course, we all hear the line, well, God chose her because there wasn't a man who was willing.
I've heard that one.
A couple of things about that. One, that's not in the Bible, not at all. Barak, who was needing encouragement to go into battle, wasn't in consideration for being a judge. He was in consideration for being a military leader. There's no indication that she was chosen because Barak said he didn't want to be judge. And the second thing that comes to mind is, when has someone's reluctance ever kept God from choosing them for a high purpose? Right? It's just, people may need convincing. Moses, I can't talk. Why are you sending me back to Egypt?
Yeah.
God overcomes that reluctance. Paul goes around killing people and doesn't want to be a Christian. He doesn't want to be Christ's spokesperson, and yet God overcomes that position. So yeah, Deborah, God couldn't overcome some other person's reluctance. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, seems kind
as
of
we say in the
far-fetched.
legal field, it's a load of hooey.
You have to look at what they actually do as compared to what they say. And I just do not buy that male aggression actually translates into being tough on crime, because we have seen it not be tough on crime. I actually forgot about this. I was revisiting some of the material from episode 2, where we talked about scapegoating of women. And we had used Joel Webben as an example. This is what I forgot, because he had said that what he wished would happen is that we would publicly execute people who made false accusations of sexual assault. So he was saying if we just had a few public executions, we wouldn't have this Me Too problem anymore. So him being quick to execute people is not necessarily going to translate into him executing child molesters and sexual predators. We see this all the time in patriarchal circles. I have been in Christian patriarchy or studying it since literally birth, and there is a very pronounced and consistent pattern of blaming victims, especially blaming victims of sexual crime. Because in patriarchy, when men are in charge, they're going to sympathize with men more easily than they're going to sympathize with women and girls and children, partly because they keep on telling themselves that women and children are so different than them, and they don't have the ability to empathize with people who are different than they are. So they're just going to default to blaming women or children in these instances. So, and they will very strongly say, well, we really are tough on child sexual predation, and we would be willing to castrate them or hang them or burn them at stake. But again, it's that scapegoating mechanism where I think if he had his perfect world, what that would look like is every once in a while, they would bring out a scapegoat who they would do all these things to and say, see, look at how tough on crime we are. But in the meantime, 99.99999% of cases would not result in a conviction.
And I don't want to speak to what would be appropriate or inappropriate. I mean, I follow the law. There are legal penalties that are set out for various types of crimes. A parking ticket is a monetary penalty. And in California, we still have capital punishment. So there can be a crime that leads to capital punishment. And then, of course, there's everything in between, large fines, incarceration, whatever it may be. The thing with the way that they look on the death penalty as the answer to these things, because it will set an example that will then prevent the misbehavior. Again, I would like them to, if they're going to say things like that, point to the studies. And there are studies that talk about whether death penalty is a deterrence or not. But their comments need to be in the context of that, not for the two of them to somehow find the imposition of the death penalty to be a laughing matter. I mean, they were joking about it and laughing with each other about it and how wonderful that is. And happily, anyone who holds that particular view and actually voices it isn't going to make it onto the bench in California. It just is inappropriate to joke about anything. I don't joke about imposing a traffic fine on somebody, let alone a case that is going to result in a life term imprisonment or something like that. And I've handed out plenty of life terms. Over 30 years, I've had those cases. But you never go back in the office and start laughing about how you really socked it to somebody. That's not the attitude a judge has. When they say sober as a judge, they're not talking about drinking. They're talking about a sober attitude. Yeah. That is what judges have. We are to be completely sober in our thinking of how we exercise our authority and our responsibilities.
So coming back to the Victorian era, people thought that women were more emotionally attuned. And for some people, this made women superior, or at least morally superior. But it was not always seen as a good thing. Some people thought that women's emotionality made them just innately childish, or even worse than that, that it made them susceptible to insanity. So instead of being seen as a good thing, like it was in the Enlightenment, the Victorian era saw emotional sensitivity as in a patronizing light, or even pathologized. And as we saw in that clip with Joel Webbon that we watched with Tim, these attitudes, they still persist today. And today we even have people talking about something that they're calling toxic empathy. I think you're going to empathize with somebody. And if you train yourself to be suspicious of people who are vulnerable, then you're going to empathize with the powerful by default, which is what we're already kind of inclined to do, because it usually is beneficial to us personally to empathize with the powerful. Coming back to that Rigney article about toxic empathy, there's a point in that article where he says, rightly used, empathy is a power tool in the hands of the weak and suffering. So, and he's saying this is a bad thing, that you have to be careful of the weak and suffering because they can use your empathy against you as if like it's a chainsaw. And this isn't just a one-off comment that he makes. This is a theme in his writing. He recently came out with a book called Emotional Sabotage, and he and Doug Wilson are doing a show about it on Canon Plus, and it's focused especially on how empathy is used against leaders. So you can see this pattern of developing suspicion against anybody who's not a man. Anybody who's not a man with power is probably out to get you, and they're probably going to try to use your empathy to control you. So when you set up that expectation, you are training yourself to have sympathy, which I understand from Tim is when we're talking about sympathy in a judicial context, that is not okay. But you're training yourself to have sympathy for the powerful.
When I hear of people who are saying it can be a tool in the hands of the weak to control the powerful, there are people who will tell you every leader is God ordained, therefore you cannot do anything to criticize or try to redirect that leadership. Although we hold elections and we use the ballot box to redirect leadership all the time. One person's out, another person's in. That happens.
But I did want to come back to your book, Tim, because I have read your book, and what I came away with I came away with a feeling of gratitude that judges are human too, because I think it's a really vulnerable thing that you did in writing that book, and telling your audience, I struggle with my mental health. I have been treated for my mental health, especially as a judge, because people have this stereotype of judges that they're supposed to be like above the level of experiencing human emotions. But I don't think that's a correct view of what a judge should be, because I'm grateful that we have judges who are humans. And I think that's what God did. If he wanted us to have computers or robots as judges, he could have done that, but he didn't. And it's important for judges to be able to experience the same things that we do. A judge who is like us, and that's something that is really our attention is drawn to it in the Bible. Jesus was incarnated as a human being so that he would be able to sympathize with our experiences, like it talks about in Hebrews. It talks all the time in the Gospels about Jesus being moved with compassion when he looks out at the crowds, and particularly moved to compassion because they are like sheep without a shepherd. So it's linking compassion to leadership and rule. And we have that example to follow because we are supposed to have compassion for each other in our own lives. In Colossians 3:12, it talks about having bowels of mercy, which is not a phrase you hear very often anymore, but it really is talking about that visceral, in your gut feeling of when you see somebody suffering and it's like you're feeling it yourself. Like that is supposed to be part of your Christian walk. And if it's not, you need to be asking yourself some hard questions.
I'm reading through 2 Corinthians right now. Paul repeatedly talks about how overwhelmed with grief and compassion and concern and tears and all these things about what he's hearing about what's happening in Corinth. And he's talking about it in the context of their response to 1 Corinthians, where he exercised a ton of judgment on what they were doing in their congregation. And he was telling them, you're doing it wrong. Here's what you should be doing. And then they had a number of questions too. And he exercised his judgment in answering those questions in that letter. And then in 2 Corinthians, he's saying, you don't know how this overwhelmed me. Let me tell you what I went through emotionally because of all of this that I was dealing with you. And I'm thinking, well, if he can exercise judgment and also talk about how overwhelmed he felt by all of it, then why is there a criticism of being a person with empathy and compassion and still exercising sound judgment? I mean, is somebody going to say, "Oh, gee, Paul, you seem a little emotional. I guess you shouldn't be exercising judgment"? I haven't heard that one yet.
Yeah.
You see,
In that interview, we were talking to Tim about a concept called sobriety. And this is a concept I know that judges are still familiar with, maybe in different language today, but it's all over the Bible that
Yeah.
just judgment involves sobriety. And
Mhm.
sobriety is actually, I don't know if we get the full picture of it. I think most people think of it as, oh, you need to be sober by not drinking alcohol
Mhm.
so that your brain is clear.
Yeah.
But actually, in Proverbs 23, there is a different aspect of inebriation that is called out, which is that alcohol numbs you to
Mm.
feeling pain.
Mm.
So that's something that really plays into how you would behave as a judge when you have somebody in front of you who is trying to elicit your sympathy because they're a victim of a crime.
Right.
And you're not able to access that part of yourself because you've numbed yourself.
Mhm.
And I think that it's easy to numb yourself because it's more comfortable. Obviously,
Yeah.
being numbed is more comfortable than being in pain. But
Right.
that is a part of something that you and I have talked about.
Mhm.
It's emotional maturity to be able
Mhm.
to tolerate that.
Mhm.
So, can you talk through a little bit about the difference between emotional maturity and emotional immaturity and what those look like in real life?
Yeah. Yeah, I can. I think a great resource for this is in a book that I highly recommend. It's called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. And she's a really helpful graph here that we've stretched out a little bit, but I think everyone can still read it. And she really compares emotional immaturity and emotional maturity. So let's just pick out some examples. Emotional immaturity, having simplistic, literal, and rigid thoughts about life. And emotional maturity would be actually appreciating nuances of life and how things do constantly change. You could be uncomfortable with that, but you could develop an appreciation for that. That would take maturity. Immature, you need to control others through guilt, anger, or shame. Maturity would be having an awareness that you can't and actually learning to not want to control others, appreciating their autonomy. So, immaturity, you would see other people as incompetent. Immaturity, you would see shortcomings as just a part of the human condition. It's a much more generous way of living with people. These resources will be something that we'll include in our resource section, so you can take some time and look through this.
So, some things that I picked up from that list
Mhm,
are things like they feel like they need to be in control of people.
mhm, mhm,
They define themselves in terms of either dominant or submissive. They define other people in terms of being dominant or submissive. So they're much more comfortable in a hierarchy,
mhm,
and they will do what they need to do to preserve that narrative that life
mhm.
is a hierarchy,
Yeah,
and this is where things fit in that picture, and they're very intolerant of anything that would disrupt that. Is
yeah,
that
yeah,
accurate?
and we might link that to, like a lack of sobriety. If we're terming it the way that we are, that you're not just like not inebriated from a substance, but also that you are feeling what you're feeling so that you can operate in the world, then numbing yourself, numbing your emotions down, and doing that to other people with fear and obligation and guilt. What you're doing is making it so that you don't have to feel so much, so that no one else will feel very much, so that you can operate in a very, very simple world. And a hierarchy is a way for you to turn off your brain. This is how it is. I'm on top. You do whatever I want. It's not actually how humans are. We have laid the groundwork for this. That is not what God intends for human beings. I'm a guy. Rachel's a guy. You watching, you're just a guy. We're all just guys. We're all just humans. None of us are gods over each other. I have as much access to Jesus, God, via the Holy Spirit, as every single person within the sound of my voice has. You have access, I have access, we're all just guys. So to say that someone's over me and is that intermediary is to turn humanity upside down and to add hierarchies that are not supposed to exist. We've talked about this in a previous episode about Confucianism, where we say that Confucianism is more similar to what a lot of Christians are doing today than what Jesus actually told us to do. When you have too many feelings, yeah, you're going to go back to a more pre-mentalistic stance. You're not going to be able to see the circumstances of somebody else. You're not going to be able to enter into their emotional experience because you're going to get overwhelmed. You have too many emotions. And I would submit to anyone who is following along with a toxic empathy thing, this is a skill issue because
Mm.
I am a therapist. My job professionally is to sit with people and their emotions, still have my emotions, manage myself. I say this to my clients all the time. In this room, I manage myself. I'm in charge of me. I have the state that watches me. I have supervisors who watch me. I have other professionals who observe me and who make sure that I'm okay so I can be in this room with you. And in this room, I have all the power. I do because this is my room. I am the therapist here. But my job is to offload that power onto you. It's for you to have your autonomy and to work with you in a collaborative way so that you can heal. So all of that, all of their intense emotions, if someone needs to cry for a whole entire hour, I need to be able to deal with that and not get taken in because I can think and I can feel at the same time. And if someone else can't think and feel at the same time, I have compassion for you because that is hard work. But it's a skill issue. And if you can't do that, then learn to do that. It is possible. And that's what emotional maturity is. It is learning to hold your emotions, other people's emotions, logic, reason, facts, and not let one overwhelm the other. You can do this. That's what's required of us as mature human beings.
Yeah. And I think what makes it hard, you and I have talked about how seriously do we take things like the so-called sin of toxic empathy.
Right.
And I think the reason why we have to take it seriously and have to address it is because there are a lot of emotionally immature people out there.
Yeah.
And the thing about if you are an emotionally immature person and you want a view of the world that fits into your very rigid, simplistic, hierarchical way of thinking, you will find your people. And one of those groups is Christian patriarchy. So when those people find each other, they create systems that the bigger they are, the more plausible it seems like, well, so many people are saying this and it doesn't feel right, but it must be right because so many people are saying it. And I think it's really important to expose it for people and invite them out of it and say there's a different way to live. In a portion of that interview that we unfortunately didn't have time to show, I was kind of making this comparison of numbness when you're feeling pain that you need to be feeling. A few years ago, I spilled hot oil on my hand and I burned the skin right off of it and it hurt like the dickens.
Yeah.
So I go to the ER and I'm in all of this pain and the doctor is saying to me, I know it hurts, but I am relieved that it hurts because that means you don't have a 3rd-degree burn. There's not nerve damage. So this is going to grow back. This is going to be okay. Your body is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, even though it feels bad right now.
Yeah.
So I think there is so much, it's very attractive to anesthetize yourself from when it's not good for you. Nerve damage is not a healthy thing that healthy bodies do.
Yeah. So anesthesia is important, but when it comes to interpersonal functioning, fear and obligation and guilt are ways that people anesthetize other people so that those people won't be feeling anything. They don't know what they're feeling. They don't know what they're thinking. And then they can kind of do whatever they want to you. Who knows what they do to you between pre-op and then when you're in post-op? Your body went from one place to another. As far as you know, that doesn't happen. Why? Because you were out. They numbed you. And then they put you from one bed and they put you on another bed and you woke up in another place. And thank goodness There are trained medical professionals who are there to take care of you. Thank goodness. But we don't want that in our relationships with people. We don't want to be numbed to other people's emotional experience. If I'm having healthy communication with people, I don't want them to feel like they can't tell me what they're thinking and they don't even know what they're thinking. That's what fear, obligation, and guilt do. They put you in a fog. And whenever you're around somebody and you realize that you just have to give them what they want, you have to sort of enter into pretend mode just to get through this, then you know that you've been given a shot of anesthesia so that you won't truly be thinking or feeling. That's not acting with everybody with their agency intact in a mature way. And we need to be aware of when that's happening to us so that we can take a step back, take a breath, and try and attune back into our own feelings. And I find that it's no surprise that opioid addiction is such a thing for people, because that's an anesthetic of the pain of life, right? Like by obtaining a drug.
And I think you made a good point that there are times when an anesthetic is appropriate. There are times when a chemical solution to a problem is appropriate. And what many people do is they misapply when and who it should be applied to. So they want somebody who's in a position of rule, a position of leadership, to be numbed so that they're not going to be affected by anything outside of them. But that's actually the opposite of how the Bible talks about rule. Proverbs 31, everybody thinks of it as the excellent wife discourse, but it's actually a fundamental text on rule from verse 1 to 9 before you get to the excellent wife stuff. And it talks about, so I've already talked about sobriety. It says, do not drink wine while you're judging. That's not appropriate. And then it says, instead, give wine to the suffering. Give wine to the people who need it. Give wine to the victims of crimes. And that it's so opposite to the way that things work in Christian patriarchy, where they're like, I need to be numb so that I can be in charge and I don't feel anything and I don't feel sorry for people.
Right.
And meanwhile, all of that, but nobody can take SSRIs. Nobody can, nobody who is without power is allowed to numb themselves to the pain of life. Like that is not okay.
If a baby is crying, I'm going to sometimes feel that baby and be distracted and go, is someone taking care of that baby? There's going to be a panic in me because I know that a baby cannot say, hello, I'm hungry. Can someone prepare me food? Babies can't do that. They can't communicate. They have to induce in you emotions so that you'll meet their needs. Why? So we'll continue to have the human race. That's a good thing. If I get hit by a car, my leg is broken, the car's on my leg, I need to go, and I scream out. So people around me will have adrenaline just from me screaming, and they'll run and lift the car off of me or something, right? Because I couldn't go, excuse me, my leg has been broken because I've been hit. But that's not what I would do, because we'd be like, we don't really believe you. That's not how people got hit by a car work. You scream and other people have a physical reaction. They rush in and help you. That is an adaptive response of humanity. Now, I don't need that to happen all the time. And I can certainly sit there with people who are grieving and who have trauma, and I can hold on to my logic and reason, and I can have my own emotional responses, and I can feel theirs because I'm skilled at that. And it doesn't mean that every time someone has an emotion, you feel it intensely, that person has done something wrong. Perhaps they are projecting out what they're feeling because they need you to feel it that way. It doesn't mean that they need to turn off the tap, that they're wrong. Maybe they don't have the capacity to explain that to you. Maybe they don't have the words. They don't have the narrative for that. That's okay. We need to be able to manage that. We need to grow in maturity and become skilled at caring for each other.
Yeah, amen to that. So earlier in this episode, we talked about the concept of primogeniture, the firstborn, and the special rights that the firstborn gets as the firstborn. They inherit property, they inherit power. And we have seen what fallen man, who we're calling this man of dust, what he does with his position of primogeniture, because Adam was created ahead of Eve. So fallen man takes his position of primogeniture and he uses it to play king of the hill, and he pushes the woman down and he pushes everyone after him down so that he can stay in this position of power. And he uses fancy rhetoric like the sin of empathy to pretend like he's doing something else. But let's look at what the second Adam, the man from heaven, does with his position of primogeniture. So in the resurrection order, Jesus is the firstborn son. He's the firstborn to be resurrected from the dead, and all of us who have been or are going to be resurrected from the dead are following in his footsteps. Colossians 1:18 says that he is the firstborn from the dead so that he might have first place in everything. So that is that concept of primogeniture in play there. Everything that the Father has, he gives to the Son freely. He not only raises him from the dead, he raises him to this position that Ephesians 1:21 says is far above all rule, all authority, all dominion. So as high as you can get, that is where the Father puts the Son. He is ruling over the world. But here's the thing. Jesus turns around and he shares that. He does not hoard it to himself. He does not feel like he needs to push Christians down so that he can maintain his supremacy. In fact, he came to earth. He became incarnated so that he could win back dominion and share it out to us. He won dominion as a human being so that he could share it with us. In Luke 12:32, Jesus says to his disciples, "Fear not, little flock, for it is the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." So this is not something that's coerced. This was the agenda all along. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit conspired together to restore us to the dominion that we lost in the garden. So instead of being this firstborn son who hoards dominion rights and wants to keep that for himself by pushing other people down, we have a firstborn son in Jesus who advocates for the reinstatement of our dominion rights after we lost them. And through his Spirit, he equips us to rule, whether we are male or female, with his wisdom, his justice, and his compassion.
Thanks for being with us today. If you're enjoying this, you may be wrestling with other questions like, is hell just a prison and God holds the keys? Should Christians just accept climate disasters and the suffering of the masses? Should Christians just dominate the public square? Have we inherited the most accurate version of the Christian faith? We tackle issues like these head on. If you want bread and butter resources, check out our Bible studies and evangelism tools and spiritual formation material. If you want answers to tough questions, check out Reconstruction. If you want to live out Christian restorative justice, check out A Long Repentance, or Plantation Capitalism versus Jesus' Jubilee Economy, or Abortion Policy in the U.S. You can find our content on our website, our YouTube channel, and on our asynchronous learning platform, or join a live class with one of our instructors. We want to connect with you, whether you're a believer or a skeptic.